Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Really happy to have all of you here today. A little bit about me. My name is Trevor Scotto. I'm a CPA, Certified Financial Planning planners, and one of the partners here at Fiduciary Financial Group. We are a true comprehensive wealth management firm, really helping very successful individuals and families make smart decisions with their investments, mitigate their taxes, protect their loved ones, and maximize their charitable intent. Many of our clients do donate many different ways, whether it's time, resources, or a combination of both. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the 5 different levels of charitable giving. And I'm really excited to have a close friend and a trusted advisor who truly specializes in philanthropy. So Patrick Sampson is the co-founder, president, and CEO of Cogio. It's a company that works with individuals, companies, and nonprofits to better understand and optimize the world of philanthropy and create a more meaningful and impactful giving experience. He also founded the Philanthropic Expansion Fund, which is a nonprofit that specializes in creating an optimal and exceptional giving experience for philanthropists. We'll cover a little bit more about this today. Lastly, prior to founding and leading these entities, Patrick was and did manage about 60 million of client investments. He was a financial advisor, but really wanted to make a bigger impact in the philanthropy space. So Patrick, thanks for being with us. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor, for having me. And that's a great introduction to Cogio and a little bit more about myself. So just to reaffirm, I was a wealth manager prior to really specializing in philanthropy. It was something that I really enjoyed as a wealth manager. And so thank you again for having me today. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I want to talk a little bit more about the presentation, just to add some context before we get started. This is purposely designed as an introduction, so it's purposely high level and a bit more simplified. And we're also not going to be covering any specific tax benefits since they can be detailed. We want to have this remain inclusive. We certainly can answer those questions as we get a little bit further into the presentation or at the end, or even as a follow-up. I also want to mention what I'm going to be presenting today and talking about with Trevor is really in the context of American philanthropy. The style can be very different around the world. Also, these are tools. It's a framework that we've created, and there are no right answers other than what's right for you. So the 5 levels of philanthropy that we'll be talking about, they really are intended to be an introduction and educate you and give you the tools to start understanding the world of philanthropy better so that you can make really good decisions. We'll have Q&A throughout, so if you have a question, you can put that in the Q&A or chat box. You also, as I mentioned, can schedule a time with Trevor and myself to talk through your specific desires more specifically. And so we'll be providing you that scheduling link as a follow-up. And also just a little bit of housekeeping. This presentation is for educational purposes only. It doesn't represent legal or tax advice. I'm not a lawyer or CPA, and your personal situations can vary. So please work with those people to finalize anything of that context. But I think this will give everyone a really good introduction and spur a lot of good thinking.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. So Pat, you and I have had multiple discussions about this, but tell us a little bit more about, philanthropy as a personal experience.
Yeah, I really wanted to start this with this context to help set the stage for how we reflect during this presentation. And it really is a personal experience. For most of the folks that we work with, philanthropy enters their mind when the perception of them having enough has been achieved. And that can be very personal. So for some people, that is having $10 in their bank account. For others, it's much more than that. But there's some point in someone's collective life or lives where that mindset flips. And so that's what I'm really excited to talk to you about today. And it's represented by the pathway of the road here. I also say that surprisingly to some, guilt can sometimes be a motivator for philanthropy. So I would be remiss not to mention that in the context of the world of philanthropy. However, I want to talk a little bit more about the 7 types of philanthropists. It was a framework that was developed by Russ Allen Prince and Karen Moreau File, and it was based on their research of motivational segmentation of philanthropy. So I'd like to go through this a little bit to talk more about these 7 and allow you to reflect on this before we go into the 5 levels of philanthropy. So the communitarian, doing good makes sense. They believe that doing good in the community is something that contributes to their personal success, and they think that philanthropy is an exchange, and it's a better way for things to get done than potentially through the government. They have the desire to give rather than feeling like it's an obligation. And they tend to believe in the institution that they give to and want to usually establish a long-term relationship with that institution. And they like to be involved and have some control. So sometimes that's joining as a board member, and they usually like recognition and public acknowledgement. By the way, the percentages are out of 100% the breakdown of these varying types that the research presented. Of course, people can be more than one. The devout, feeling good or feeling that God's will is to do good, and 96% of their giving is to religious institutions. They feel as though faith in the leadership of the institution is strong, and it's their moral obligation to give and God's desire that they help others. So giving is an act of stewardship. And the devout doesn't care as much about recognition, but religion is a very powerful motivator for philanthropy. The next is the investor. So the investor says that doing good is good business. They are very careful about investing in the organizations that they give to, and they look for measurable returns. They also view philanthropy as a business relationship, and they're highly motivated to avoid taxes. They feel no moral imperative, but they are very skeptical of altruistic giving. They don't really want to get involved too actively in the day-to-day operations. However, the attention and respect are very important to them. The next is the socialite. So they like having fun in their volunteer work, and that is the main reason why they get involved. They like to be creative, especially in planning social events. They view philanthropy as a social exchange, and the selection of the organizations they work with is purely a social decision. And they feel the organizations are the right place for them and their family. They do generally look for formal recognition and love to be honored, and they're influenced by the social implication of their work and contributions. The next is the repayer. So doing good in return. These are people that have felt like an organization has given them something special in the past, or that they've had a life-changing experience with that organization. They're very focused in their giving, and the effectiveness and service delivery are very important to them. The next one is the altruist. So this is a group that they believe is giving is the right thing to do, and they're genuinely selfless, and they almost always focus more on social issues and causes. And they also believe that if you're wealthy, you have a greater obligation to give. And by and large, they're not influenced by others. They also really like to know the leaders of the organization. And the last one is the dynast. So this usually comes from affluent families. They grew up in families where there's a tradition of giving. The parents talk a lot about it, and they often have a family foundation of some kind. Interestingly, there's often generational difference in the organizations that they like to give to, and they often do not follow family tradition in the causes they support. They're generally also the most selective type of philanthropist. They really do their homework, and they focus on core missions of an institution. So with that, Trevor, that really are the 7 types of philanthropists. I think it would be great to reflect on a lot of this and think about who you are as setting the stage for the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, looking at these 7 different types, I can definitely see myself as a couple of these for sure, and I'm sure those folks watching this the same as well. So Pat, yeah, why don't we just dive into kind of the 5 levels of philanthropy? I know you and I've chatted about this quite a bit as well, and I think you do an incredible job of laying it out clearly. So tell us a little bit more about the 5 different levels.
Yeah, so from the bottom to the top of this screen is from least involved time-wise and financially in some cases to most involved and most time, and in some cases financial commitment, and everywhere in between. So the structure of our presentation today is to go over each one of these individually so that each is thoroughly described. You can get more information, take some of the information from the personal reflection slide, think about how involved you might want to be in philanthropy as an introduction, and see where you might land on one or a few of these.
Fantastic. Should we dive into direct gifts?
Yeah. So a direct gift is in the form of a check, cash, a transfer of stock. In Trevor's world, a qualified charitable distribution from a retirement account. And it can be physical assets as well, land, cars, those types of things. It's the simplest and most straightforward option to give to a nonprofit. It allows you to select one or more nonprofits at any given point in time in the year, and generally speaking, benefit from the financial tax deduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point here. And would like to share, 2 great strategies. One is gifting appreciated stock. We'll be diving into this a little bit more. But also the qualified charitable distribution for a lot of our, successful families in retirement after you hit, now it's 72 in today's tax law. Rather than taking the RMD, if you don't need it or you'd like to give, you can actually send the money directly to a 501c3. And you don't have to pay tax, and you do get credit for the R&D for that year. So Pat, tell us a little bit more about, what would you say is a good case study for folks thinking about this level here?
Sure. So if you're in that devout category, a direct check to your religious institution would be a direct gift. Or if you do an online processing to a food bank, those are all examples of direct gifts. And the advantages of that is it's the simplest to transact. Quite literally, you could write a check, be done. And it's really easy to administer, and you receive generally the financial tax deduction benefits for doing so. And you're generally looking to empower others to operate programs on your behalf. Some things to consider, though, it's self-directed. So your experience, unless you're working with an advisor, you're taking control of that. So doing the research to make sure that you're making a good donation investment. That means also that the donor experience can more easily lack meaning. This is one of the reasons why we started the Philanthropic Expansion Fund. Nonprofits do their best to provide what the money you contribute does for the organization, but there's lots of room to grow there. So if you're writing a direct gift, if you don't have a direct relationship with the nonprofit institution, it can be hit or miss in your experience. And of course, we always want you to have the best giving experience possible. It doesn't necessarily also maximize your legacy or brand. If you're that dynast mentality of really liking that type of tradition, direct gifts aren't necessarily the most effective tool for that, although it can be used in that way. And also, finally, you're not really administering your own programs. You're empowering, like in the advantage section, you're empowering others to operate those programs instead.
Awesome. So it sounds like it's a pretty simple method for most folks.
It's a great place to start if you're just getting started in philanthropy and would really like to start small, be effective in the way that you think about things, and really enter into the world of philanthropy. Direct gifts are a great way to do that.
Fantastic. Well, Pat, why don't we move on? This is something that I'm excited about, but the second level. Tell us a little bit more about the Philanthropic Expansion Fund, what it is, and why you created it.
Yeah, the Philanthropic Expansion Fund, also known as PEF as an initialism, it's for people who really value a full service experience. So it's similar to the financial advisor relationship you have with Trevor. You empower a philanthropy expert to allocate and apply your donation dollars based on your recommendations of sectors and geographical areas to where the greatest charitable impact value is achieved. So almost in the same way that you on your investment side would empower a mutual fund manager to allocate your investments, the same structure here is in the PEF. So some of the advantages of that are the PEF goes to supporting what we call capacity building, which is really organizational development and fundraising work with organizations. And so your support enables more funding to come into organizations. Our track record is for the gift that is given, 18 times more money comes into an organization over a 3-year period of time because of applying those resources. So it's really powerful. And so for the investment-minded person in particular, this is a really effective tool. Also, like your relationship with the financial advisor, the PEF does really quality stewardship. So sharing financial updates of how much money has been raised because of your donation, how much you've empowered, as well as sharing qualitative items such as photos and videos and storytelling. We assign also someone as a relationship manager, and in many cases work with the financial advisor to deliver that high touch experience. So it's really for that person or couple that really likes empowering a professional to do something and enjoys being along the ride in that experience. There's also no associated costs. It's completely free. It's a 501c3, so contributions to it have tax deductibility the same way as writing a check to an organization. And then additionally, you can use a donor advised fund, which we'll talk about next, to contribute to the Philanthropic Expansion Fund.
So
Go ahead, Trevor.
Pat, before we move on to the next level, I did want to dive in a little bit more. It does sound like the experience when you donate to the Philanthropic Expansion Fund is much more than simply donating a check and just simply getting a letter back. It sounds like donating here, you kind of get to, as the donee, kind of see where your money goes and the impact that it has over the subsequent years.
You're absolutely right. And in our experience, what we call stewardship, which is the act of an organization communicating with the donor, when it's done properly, it's really meaningful for both involved, the organization and the donor. And so what the PEF really looks to achieve is not only add value to the organization, but add value to the donation experience. Something to consider, there's 2 levels to it. So there's a general fund where there's no minimum. And then you can establish a personal fund, which is a lot more high touch. So if anyone's interested in this, we can definitely provide more information, but really excited to share this today and expose a little bit more about the Philanthropic Expansion Fund.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Pat. Let's dive right into the donor advised fund. I would say probably this level provides your high level of flexibility. I know a lot of our clients have these set up, and a good example would be if you want to give, you just don't know how much and when, but you're looking for a tax deduction this year. You can donate directly to the donor advised fund, get the tax deduction this year, and then figure out when and who to give money to. What's also unique, I wanted to touch on this too, is a lot of folks, some of our families are in tech, they gift appreciated stock, and that's a pretty powerful method because you're getting the tax deduction this year for the full fair market value. You're not having to pay any tax. So some families, if you have the ability to either give cash, after tax cash, or stock, in a lot of ways, gifting stock is actually a way to maximize the charitable intent. So Pat, tell us a little bit more about the donor advised fund and who might be a good candidate for this.
Yeah, as we move up the 5 levels of philanthropy, the donor advised fund sort of sits right in that middle ground. So the difference between a donor advised fund and, say, the Philanthropic Expansion Fund is the Philanthropic Expansion Fund is deploying that capital 100% right away. With a donor advised fund, the style is a more permanent endowment style charity fund you establish with a special type of nonprofit organization that operates these. You can think of them almost like a charity bank account where you distribute grants from. And some of the advantages of it is you get the immediate tax deduction, but you don't necessarily have to decide where to give right away. Based on the legal setup of it, when you make that contribution, you're technically contributing to a 501c3. So as Trevor mentioned, it allows you to not have to make a decision of where you want to give right away, but if you have a big taxable event, like you're selling a company or a lot of income in a year, it's a very effective way to set yourself up for a long, long time in a more permanent endowment style fund to have resources to make grants from that account. So it's much simpler than a private foundation to administer. We'll get into that next as the next layer up.
Mm-hmm.
Another advantage is that you truly can be anonymous. So because of the structure, you're giving to an organization and that organization is administering a donor advised fund for you. For example, Schwab Charitable is one. Trevor can give you many more examples of them. They request that you make for a distribution from your account to an organization. You have the choice of whether or not to include your name on that. So if you wanted to be anonymous, truly anonymous, you can use this tool, make the request that a distribution is made to an organization, and the organization would only see that it's coming from the community foundation that it's set up on. And as I mentioned, it's probably the most popular choice because it's the middle ground between that direct giving and private foundation when it comes to grant making. That's the pure purpose of this. So like direct gifts, it's self-directed. So you're just formalizing with a much more structured tool to do your, in essence, the same grant making work. And that donor experience can more easily lack meaning because you're still directing that, you're self-directing it. You're not administering your own programs, so there's less flexibility there. You're still supporting others' programs. And in the past, there have been administrative fees that have been much higher than they are today. So it's not as much as a thing to consider now, but there are some fees involved to administer them. Although, as like I mentioned, that's becoming less and less of an issue. But a donor advised fund is a really good example of a tool that gives you lots of advantages, and it's very popular in working with wealth managers as a tool to set up giving for the long run for clients.
Fantastic. And yeah, just to let everybody know, setting up a donor advised fund is quite easy. We use Schwab Charitable, very great organization. But yeah, very easy to set up. Pat, we actually have a question, and this might be a way to also distinguish some differences between the DAF and the PEF. Question Julia has is, what criteria do you use to select the nonprofits in each category? And just to confirm, is the PEF registered as a 501c3?
The second question I'll answer first, and the answer is yes. It's an exempt organization with the IRS, so it's a public charity. So it has all the tax advantages of the same as giving to the food bank or to Meals on Wheels or another entity. For us in the work that we do to produce that 18x multiplier, which we call the return on contribution or ROC, to really maximize that, we do a really robust audit in our decision-making process. And in our experience, we vastly weight the leadership of an organization, and that's the executive director and the board of directors. And there's a lot of criteria that we go into, but we heavily weight that 95% of it. So what we know is that quality teams can produce value. The program development that can be done with quality leadership, structural replication that can be done with leadership. We also tend to focus our commitments on smaller to medium organizations that have a vast opportunity to grow, as well as their impact can be exponential. And we really like to shape and form the culture of an organization within our work inherently. And so that market and that demographic tends to be where our greatest value can be achieved. And then it's also our goal not to work with them forever. So getting them into a place where they're focused on what they need to be doing and have all the tools to succeed after a period of time. But that's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. I'd
Uh,
also like to provide an
yeah, love,
example for the donor advised fund,
sure.
right?
Pat, quick
Yeah.
question is, how long has the PEF been around?
Another good question. So Cogio started 12 years ago, and the PEF operates the same core work that Cogio does. So the work and the people that are servicing the PEF, that has been going on for a long time. There's lots of experience. The PEF has been around for about a year. So although it's a younger organization, the leadership and the fundamentals behind it have really been thoughtfully grown to prepare for its launch. And we're thoroughly excited about it as a tool for people.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thanks for answering those, Pat. Tell us a little bit more. It sounded like you had a good case study for a donor advised fund.
Yes, so as we get into these higher levels, I wanted to provide some tangible examples for people so that you all can see the theoretical into the practical. So one of the most famous examples of a donor advised fund is Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla. They established a donor advised fund with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So instead of going and doing a private foundation, which we'll talk about next, they decided to leverage the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which operates donor advised funds, to establish one of the largest donor advised funds in the United States. It's over $1 billion. And they do the majority of their public charity work through that entity. So, as Trevor mentioned, a really big advantage for people in tech, especially, but others that are business owners, these donor advised funds allow you to transfer stock, unrecognized gained stock, into these donor advised fund accounts. And that can be a real advantage when it comes to time to managing taxes as well as getting resources into a charitable entity. So that's the example for the donor advised fund.
Awesome. Last thing to point out, just for the folks here watching, that is, once you do give to the donor advised fund, the nice thing is those funds can actually be invested. And so, assuming that the stock market does well over the years, your potential gift can also continue to grow. So that's just one thing to point out. Well, good. Let's jump right into the higher tier, the next level, the private foundation. I've talked about this. I think the biggest myth out there that we want to bust is the fact that you don't need to be a single family office or multifamily office with 100 million or more. You really can do this on a much smaller scale. So Pat, tell us a little bit more about the private foundation, some advantages and things to consider.
Not only in the private foundation, but the entire spectrum of the five levels of philanthropy, and it just tends to be highlighted in the private foundation. The myth is that you have to have a lot of money to either do it or be impactful, and that's just not the case. So thanks for mentioning that right up front, Trevor. I think it's really important for people because they hear large families or famous people doing private foundations, and I think the assumption is that that is a requirement, and it's really not. But in the private foundation, you're now getting into the space where you're creating your own legal entity. So you're not leveraging your own direct check writing or some other organization to administer. You're starting your own, truly, in this level. And so the intention there is to be a longer lasting entity that typically has the primary purpose of giving money away via grant making or operating scholarship programs. So this tool, if you're interested in operating a scholarship program, this is probably the most effective way to do it. Some of the advantages that you have is that you ultimately have more control over the giving because it's collectively controlled by the board. And you have a full spectrum of exposure opportunities from anonymous again, although it's a little bit more difficult to be anonymous if you use a private foundation versus a donor advised fund, to a vast legacy, branding, and notoriety opportunity. So some of you might have heard of these things. And you can do more creative and innovative grant making with your own entity because you're making the rules. And there's a lot of things that you can do, from international grant making to doing grant making to for-profit entities that support various things. That's something not a lot of people know about, and we know how to do. And we do a lot of that in startups that are working in certain demographics and doing certain things, social impact investing. You can do some really cool things there. There is more administrative responsibility than using a direct giving or a DAF or the PEF, as I mentioned. So you have to set up your own legal entity and get confirmation from the IRS and file tax returns each year. But we can help you through that so that you don't have to do any of that or another advisor. I wouldn't want that to be a deterrent for anyone. But if you're looking to get a little bit more involved in your work and really like the idea of control, the private foundation can be a really good tool for you.
Awesome. Awesome. And Pat, just for the folks out there, are you able to walk us through the process of how to set up a private foundation?
Yes. So like a for-profit business, a nonprofit is generally structured as a corporation. So when you register it with a state, you're registering a business entity. It can be registered as a trust, but by far the most popular is it's registered as a corporation. So that's the first step. After that's done, you get an EIN number, which is easy with the IRS, and you register with the state's Department of Justice or Attorney General to let them know, hey, we're wanting to be a nonprofit organization. That's not enough to be able to offer people a tax deduction. The next step after registering with the state and with the applicable governing bodies overseeing it is performing what is called a 1023 application, and that's with the IRS, the federal government. And that's a little bit more comprehensive step there. And on that, you answer a lot of questions like who is on your board, what do you want to do, what programs do you want to operate. This is where the IRS determines whether you're a private foundation or a public nonprofit. We can go into that a little bit more. But we do that on behalf of clients all the time. And submitting that then is a process of about anywhere from 4 to 7 months of waiting. And until the IRS looks at the application and examines it and then provides you a yes or no approval for your application. And once you get that application, then you're officially under the eyes of the federal government and state a 501c3. So you can offer tax benefits at that time. There's a few other steps involved, but I think that covers the highest level of if you are intending to start one. The process takes about 7 to 9 months, depending on where the IRS is at and looking at those applications. And it's a little bit more complex than just starting an LLC or another type of business. And mainly that's because the IRS wants to make sure if it is an organization that's going to get that tax status, that there's no money laundering or abuse or any of those types of things that are going to be going on.
Awesome. Awesome. And for those out there, if you might be feeling overwhelmed, you might be thinking private foundation sounds like what I want to do, but there seems to be a lot of steps. You can actually reach out and work with Pat and Kojio directly. And that's one of the things that they do is, help families set up private foundations. Another topic that I wanted to cover, you mentioned this a little bit, was the scholarships. I know this has come up quite a few times this year, especially with the stock market doing so well. But, folks have been saying, hey, I want to set up a scholarship for folks. How do I do that in a way that maintains the tax deductibility? So one key feature to know is, if you do maintain control of ultimately who gets the grant, if it's not in a private foundation, then it's not tax deductible. And so that's why I waited to bring that up in the private foundation, is because the way to do that is by setting up the private foundation. Pat, did you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. The private foundation is one way to have ultimate control. Some educational institutions, they'll allow you to set up a program inside of their institution. But as I mentioned, there's just not as much control over that. So that is an option. You can do that. But the private foundation is by far going to give you the most control. So the IRS, and we get a little more technical here, but keep it as high level as I can. The IRS requires something called a charitable class, which is just a fancy term for saying you have to define what the scholarship is for and who's eligible to receive it. And that can be really narrow. So the example I use is the graduating seniors at a local high school. That can be a charitable class. It could be soccer players at a soccer club who are going off to college, or any sorts of things that you define as a general class. And then you also have to have a process of application. So whether that's accepting applications online and advertising that opportunity, whether that's handing things out, there has to be some effort around allowing anyone within that charitable class to apply. And then the board ultimately can have control at the end of the day of who is awarded, as long as they meet that charitable class. So there's some process around this. I want to let people know that it's very common for us to work with people to take any administrative work out of this that they desire not to do or want to partner with us on. So that can be as small as us handing them 5 applications. They get together annually as a family and make a decision, and we do all the rest, to quite literally linking arms in the process if this is something that you enjoy, and doing that work together and everywhere in between.
Awesome. Fantastic. And Pat, last question on this section here, but what type of philanthropists tend to set up private foundations?
The investor and the dynasts tend to be most common, although the repayer also is very much someone that looks to do this type of giving. It also is something that people, when they think about long after their own lives, wanting a surviving entity to be a resource for the community, this is a great tool to use. So people in particular, in sort of that dynast investor mindset, they are very focused on using this as the tool, because the intention is much more of a long-term, even potentially passing on to multiple generations entity.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I think we did an awesome job covering the private foundation. I think the next slide, we can kind of dive into the public nonprofit space. Some of us will recognize, the nonprofits as some of our favorite charities. So Pat, can you tell us a little bit more about how you defined a public nonprofit, and, what are some of the advantages and things to consider if folks are
Sure.
exploring setting one up?
Before we go into that, I would want to show a real life example of a private foundation.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to go ahead and flip over here to a web screen. This is the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. So you might recognize them from the Hewlett Packard. It is the engineer and entrepreneur behind that, one of them. And they exclusively do grant making, and their charitable purpose is fairly broad. It's a nonpartisan private charitable foundation that advances ideas and supports institutions to promote a better world. So in that description, it gives them a lot of flexibility into how they do their grant making. So before we leave the private foundation spot, I just wanted to give people an example of that.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Pat.
So let's go into the public nonprofit. So this is the highest level of time dedication. Again, you create your own legal entity that intends to be longer lasting. That difference between the private foundation and the public nonprofit from the administrator standpoint is that you're really looking to run programs instead of just make grants. And another key difference is that you strategically would want to raise funds for operating revenue from the public, from yourself, and or both. So the structure that this most empowers are great opportunities to leave a lasting legacy in a different way, and giving you the opportunity to be more directly involved in a more meaningful and time commitment capacity. You also can get financial support from others to support your programs. That's a key difference between the private foundation and the public nonprofit. So some things to consider we really advise people to do some research or empower us to do some research for them on their behalf to make sure that what they want to do doesn't overlap with something that already exists or that's something that's doing it really, really well. So if there's a humane society already in your local area and they're, in your opinion, doing a really great job, it might make more sense to involve yourself in other ways with an existing entity, because it would take away that administrative responsibility and still, in essence, give you the same benefits. A public nonprofit also has more administrative elements than the 4 levels below them, but they also can be handed off to staff. One thing I did not mention in the private foundation section that I think is important to mention, which is also relevant in the public nonprofit section, is you can hire people, you can hire staffs and pay them salaries to operate the entity. So in a private foundation, if you wanted to hire someone to run that for you as the executive director, and they're operating that, you can do that. And that can also be family members or people close to you, if that's something that you want to empower as an employment opportunity. So yeah, that's the public nonprofit. I would love to, unless Trevor, you have any questions, I'd love to show a few examples in this section.
That'd be great.
Okay, so some of you might know LeBron James. He's a basketball player. He started the LeBron James Family Foundation. Although it's called the Family Foundation, it's in the structure of the 5 levels of giving. It's the public nonprofit. It's the highest level. They have a fantastic web presence. And what they do is they, in essence, have set up a program called the I Promise program that supports kids in LeBron's hometown of Akron, Ohio, by providing them with program support and mentors in order to be successful in school and beyond. So they've really focused on education as their main focus, and more specifically in the geographical area of Akron. So LeBron seed funded this with a big contribution, but they have fundraising staff that raises money from others. They also have staff that operates these programs. It's a phenomenal program. It's one of the best that I've seen with that intention. Other examples, the Andy Warhol Foundation, they mainly do grant making, but they also have programs. So they're structured in the realm of the public nonprofit. For people that are in New York, one that you might know is called the Robin Hood Foundation, or Robin Hood. Robin Hood was set up initially by people on Wall Street that really wanted to make a difference in fighting poverty in New York City. It was about 30 years ago. They operate programs as well as support other nonprofits. So those are some examples of nonprofits. Others that you might be aware of are Meals on Wheels or your food bank. My favorite example is Bill Nye's Planetary Society. I think a misnomer in the nonprofit world is that these organizations just need to be something that focuses on basic human services. Although that is a sector of the nonprofit industry, it also can be so much more, from, as I mentioned, Bill Nye's Planetary Society, which explores space, to education institutions, to hospitals, to youth sports clubs, and many other things. So definitely, if you can conceptualize an idea, this is probably something that could be fit into a nonprofit structure if you really wanted to. And of course, you wouldn't have any ownership in that entity, but it would be able to more than likely be registered and operate those programs.
Awesome. Well, Pat, yeah, thank you so much for sharing the 5 levels, and kind of to wrap things up. What should people take away from all of this?
I want you to think about what resonates with you. And that's what today was all about. It was to giving you some more context to start to think of yourself in one of those 7 categories of philanthropists, to also have a framework and an introduction to understanding the different levels of philanthropy. In many cases, this is brand new to people. It's a what's next in their life. And so providing this framework is a really great place to start. And also thinking about where you're at in your life. Some typical scenarios we see that are especially relevant are people who are retired with excess funds who want to start to consider doing some philanthropy. That's a very typical touch point. Another is a business owner that just sold their business. So if you have a large, what they call exit, meaning a large sale, and you made a lot of money from that sale, doing one of these things within the same tax year is really highly advantageous to set yourself up for the rest of your life. So the timing of that is really important. So if you're a business owner or you know a business owner, don't waste time talking with us. The donor advised fund in particular is very popular in this scenario because you're thinking of lots of different things when you sell your business or have a large equity event, and it can be a very turnkey way to basically buy yourself some time. Also, if you're an employee at a company, if you have a matching program, coupling your direct gifts or even giving through a donor advised fund or other areas and having your company match that, it's a great opportunity. So that's something to consider. And a lot of companies have programs. Also, if you're already part of a legacy planning family, or you're looking for a new and innovative way to give, that's a really common scenario that we see in this presentation. Some things to consider when you're thinking about this. What do you want to donate? Time, energy, money, or all the above? I think answering that question is going to help you think through what level is right for you. Also, do you want to donate during your lifetime? And if so, how much? Or is the alternative for you, do you want to donate after you pass away? Are you someone who wants to enjoy what you've gathered for yourself during your lifetime, but also sees the opportunity for your resources to have vast amounts of impact after you're gone? Something to think about. Legacy planning is a lot of work that we do with people thinking about putting charities as beneficiaries in their estate. You know, all 5 levels have that opportunity. There could be a method that really makes sense for you.
Awesome. Well, now I think, Pat, thanks for sharing that. I think it's some great insight. Now I would like to open it up for some Q&A. So folks watching this, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. I know, kicking things off, a couple of questions that I get quite often is, who can be on the board of a private foundation?
So a private foundation can be, depending on which state you're registered in, you can have just one person, but generally we recommend at least 3. And those people can all be from the same family. They can be anyone else that you want. Something to consider is, do they have a financial interest in some of the assets in the endowment, which is a very popular structure for private foundation to use. So like a retirement account, you have an investment account that you make grants from. If you have ownership in that company, there's some things that you just have to consider. From a technicality standpoint, the IRS, has some questions about, but generally speaking, anyone can be on a board with you, your family. It could be solely family members. It could be family members and friends. It could be people that you trust. It's really a wide spectrum of what's possible.
Awesome. Another question that we get quite a bit is, we kind of covered this, but how long does it actually take to set up a private foundation?
Typically about 9 months. And the same goes for a nonprofit. The process that I described of registering with the state, telling the state's attorney general about it, then doing the 1023 application, that's the same process whether you're registering a private foundation or a nonprofit. So both of those take about 9 months. The check writing obviously is right away. There's no setup for that. PEF, same thing. It's just making a contribution. There's no setup involved with that, other than letting us know and establishing a relationship with you. A donor advised fund as well is pretty immediate and requires just a couple of pages of paperwork for you to commit to setting that up, similar to how you would set up a bank account at a bank. So those 3 on the bottom are much faster. The others at the highest level, the private foundation and the nonprofit, they're about 7 to 9 months to fully get approved. However, you can start doing activity once you register with the state. It just is kind of this limbo period of being able to get a tax deduction for any contributions. So we generally say, just don't do much unless you really need to in that period of time until the IRS gives you that permission.
Good, that's great. Another question that came in is, how much does it cost to set up a private foundation?
With the state, it will register is about $40. It's very cheap. With the IRS, the 1023 application is $600. Those are the main expenses from a hard cost standpoint. And then our time, we try to make that very affordable. Also, in comparison to a lawyer's time, we try to keep it in and around about $2,000 in total. Sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, depends how complex the application needs to be. But we try to keep that really affordable for people so that we can inspire them to go deeper into philanthropy.
Awesome. Awesome. Another question is, I'm interested in giving internationally. Which strategy should I be looking at?
A donor advised fund, if you work with the right entity, sometimes they'll allow you to do grant making internationally. If you're looking to do that on a more regular basis and you are intent on doing that more often, I would say go the private foundation route, because as listed in the advantage section, you have much more control over that process. And so it'll allow you to do what's necessary in order to make that happen a lot faster. And at the end of the day, you're the one making that decision.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I think that covers our time for today. Pat, really wanted to thank you so much for your insight, for joining us today. Philanthropy is such a meaningful topic for us and for a lot of our clients. I'm glad we were able to really dive into this. As a reminder, everybody, we are recording this. Will be available on our website. Also, if you're interested in exploring what strategy might make the most sense for you, feel free to feel free to reach out anytime to me or Patrick or anybody at the Fiduciary Financial Group team. Just want to wish you all a great and productive day, and thank you all.